Get yourself in the lotus position, because I've got no plan, no pretense, and definitely no bypassing. I'm Josh Connolly, and this will probably be dysfunctional. So I think there's a bit of a call for celebration, because this is episode 10 of Dysfunctional. So it's incredible that we've made it here. And because it is episode 10, I have a confession to make. And that confession is, I feel a little bit like I may have been playing it a little bit safe with this podcast. One of the reasons that I started to do a podcast is because I've got a lot to say. And longer form gives me the opportunity to be able to talk about the things that I want to talk about. And to be able to go in a bit more depth about them. I love to unpack things. I love to try and openly formulate an opinion, to try and see things from all angles and then try and decide what my opinion is and know that I can change my opinion at any time. I live with a bit of a belief that I could be wrong about everything that I've ever believed in. And that's quite exciting for me, in my opinion. And so I've always tried to be that way with my opinion, and it's something that I've wanted to bring to this podcast. And although I believe that the subjects that I've tackled already on here, I've kind of done that, I do feel a little bit like I've probably picked safe ones. I have a lots of opinion on things that go on in culture within our society, and I want to bring that to this podcast. I've called this podcast Dysfunctional. And so look, this podcast will evolve all of the time. And this, I've been chatting to a friend about it who said to me in the best way, like, push yourself a bit more out of your comfort zone with this. And they're right. And so that's what I'm going to do, is push myself out of the comfort zone a bit more. And this podcast, they also said, and they're right, that this won't be the last evolution of the podcast. And so what you're going to find is, I think often, like today, I'll tackle a couple of different subjects if I can. Today, I want to talk a little bit about a mixture of what we're seeing, some of the movement that we're seeing going on in culture at the moment. So if you didn't know, the DE&I initiatives within big companies like Amazon and Meta, Ford, McDonald's, they're looking at scaling those back. And I just want to talk about what I think that means for society. And I also want to dive down a little bit further into what I believe is some hysteria that we're seeing now. And what I hope is hysteria anyway. And give some examples of how that happens throughout society and how we good meaning people based on what is good meaning people during any culture can change. And that'll make sense in a minute. And then today I'm also going to talk about scapegoats. So we'll do the first part where I talk a little bit about what's going on in the culture in the world today. And then we're going to go into talking a bit about the scapegoats, because that's become something that's really important to me. So I don't know if you've seen, like, I've had this long-standing opinion around the whole DE&I conversation. Firstly, let me say this really clearly. Anybody that doesn't know what DE&I, it's diversity and inclusion within organizations and within companies. So there's lots of companies now, or individuals as well, that go into companies and help these groups of people, large groups of people within a company, understand how you can try and reach some kind of equity, right? How we can make sure that we are meeting the needs of all, not just cultures, but all different types of people as well. So LGBTQ plus, well-being even could be in there when you look at like the neurodiversity stuff. And then of course, race as well. That one of the issues that I think's happened is that as a society, I believe we've become so, and I think this is a lot to do through social media as well. And I've talked about this already on previous podcasts, but we've become so obsessed with looking like we're doing the right thing that we've lost our way and stopped actually doing the right thing. And so this scaling back that we're seeing from big companies in DE&I think is similar to when we saw Trump come into power again in America, which has a lot to do with, I think, the left becoming quite unattractive. Being a left-sided person. So, look, I don't fully buy into the whole left and right idea of politics anyway, but I would have always seen myself as quite left-sided and as quite liberal, right? If you ever listen to the 115 Miles podcast, which we started, it's probably like 5 years ago now. I used to get myself in trouble for being a bit too much of a lefty, right? I upset people because I'm a bloody lefty, right? But today, in today's world, I feel quite politically homeless in that sense, because the left now feels like it's a little bit like walking on eggshells. And when you reach a place where particularly good, well-meaning people, and this links to the scapegoat stuff that I'm going to talk about in a bit, when you reach a place where good, well-meaning people feel like they can't speak their truth, any relationship is doomed to failure. One-to-one relationships, that's true. And that's also true in relationships between thousands of people, within communities, or within corporate structures. When there's people within any group or any demographic of people that feel like they can't speak their truth, particularly if their truth comes with some fear around things, then what you will find is that resentment will build. And then when somebody is resentful, extreme views of the opposite can then become apparent. So let me give you an example of what I mean. If you break this down to make it easier to understand, in a one-to-one relationship, say the wife is upset because they feel like they can't talk about what they're struggling with. If the husband isn't then able to listen to that, then that will get pushed down, it will fester, and then they will become resentful. And then when their husband makes maybe like an honest mistake, you can see that they would then be able to flip out, and their view of that honest mistake could then become extreme, right? It could become disproportionate to what the mistake is. And that's because they've not been able to voice their opinion in the past. And so there's all this kind of stuff festering inside. I believe that's happening within communities. I believe that's happening within society. And I believe that's happening within work cultures. We're getting to this place now. And this is the reality, is when you talk about things like misinformation and hate speech, and you might have seen that Mark Zuckerberg has also been on Joe Rogan podcast. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I've only seen clips and I do want to listen to that. But he has talked about as well this around misinformation and around hate speech, and there's the food van that interrupts me when I do the podcast at this time. Shall we sit and listen to it? If you've not listened to previous episodes, when the food van turns up, it sounds like an ice cream van, and it's trying to let you know that there's food available. And I'm going to let it play out because this is the Dysfunctional podcast and I don't edit anything. So that will be sticking in there. But Mark Zuckerberg has come out and talked about, and listen, look, I think Mark Zuckerberg is probably an alien. I think he fucking looks like an alien. I don't like or dislike Mark Zuckerberg. I think somebody with that amount of money is very easy for somebody like me to dislike. I think that's true. That sort of general consensus is that we don't like him. Is that right? And again, like if I drive down into that, why don't we like him? I don't really fucking know anything about him. But he's talked about the whole misinformation and hate speech, and how when we try to censor this, and this is my big belief on this, is when you start to censor misinformation and hate speech, there may be, in both examples, particularly hate speech, really obvious examples of when hate speech is hate speech and it should be stopped, right? There's obvious examples of like homophobia, racism, where hate speech is bad. However, or maybe that can become politicized. So then when you start to broaden what hate speech is, you start to bring opinion in. When you start to broaden what misinformation is, you start to bring opinion in. Do I want to hand the power of deciding what is misinformation to me? Do I want to hand that to somebody powerful like Mark Zuckerberg? No, I don't. I want you to give me all of the information and I'll make my own decision on it. That's vitally important to me. Now, I believe, by the way, that even good people could start to get things around misinformation and hate speech wrong, right? And they can do it from a place of good intention. Now, let me just tell you how good people can become like people that do bad things. I can't think of the fucking word, right? But there was an example. I think I read this in a book. I think this was from, I might be wrong here, but I'm going to tell you because it's a great book anyway. It's a book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Us. And it's about how politicians never fully admit to taking responsibility, but how good people can get involved in politics and then end up doing bad things. Yeah. So they talk about this made up scenario, but like where a policeman is chasing somebody who they know is a drug lord, right? So they've seen them dealing drugs, but they haven't got the evidence of it. And so they're chasing this drug dealer and he chases him all the way and he runs into a house and this drug dealer runs into the toilet and chucks hypothetically kilos of drugs down the toilet just as the copper gets there, flushes the chain and it's gone. Now, the police person might arrest them, take them into the car and think, you know what, I got some drugs in this car. I know this person. I know that I saw them, but I can't prove it because my body cam weren't on or whatever, yeah? Can't prove it. So let me just plant these drugs that I found on him and we can get this guy off the street and send him to prison. When like you could see how that would happen, how a good person would think, well, look, I've seen it with my own eyes. It's very, very clear. But you can then also see how once they do that, they then can become susceptible to doing it again, right? But then the next time that they do it, it might be like, well, I haven't actually seen it myself, but I trust my colleague wholeheartedly and they saw it, so we're going to do it again. And then you can see how that can progress and progress and progress until they're doing things based on their opinion. And this is where it gets problematic when we start to talk about hate speech, and misinformation and giving that power to decide what is hate speech and what is misinformation to other people. That becomes problematic. Now, I've had some discussions on LinkedIn because one of the things that's happened with this, one of the ways that misinformation's been called out, and I talked, I think, briefly about this on a previous podcast, but people would, like, I believe, scapegoating Stephen Bartlett, who was getting people on his podcast, and they were saying, well, it's like misinformation. And there was a particular podcast, everybody says, oh, where the guy says that keto can cure cancer. He doesn't actually say that, by the way, for a start. And I'm not defending him. I did listen to the podcast. It felt like a very alternative view. I'm interested in alternative views. But what he actually said was that he said that he feels like what we do, the way that we treat cancer still today is quite barbaric. I think he uses the word draconian. Is that the right word? Is that the right way to say it? And he says things like keto and changing your diet can support managing cancer is what he says, right? I'm not a fucking doctor. I don't know if that's true or if that's false. Now, what happens is people go, well, we must stop that because what happens if somebody who has got cancer stops going through the way that we know is the best option through what we've done and goes along this route and they end up dying. And I understand that fear, right? That fear comes from a very good place. It comes from caring about people that have got cancer. It comes from a place of caring for vulnerable people. I can see the rationale, logic behind it when somebody is vulnerable and feels like they have no other option, right? You could see how they might go down that route. The rationale and the logic makes sense. However, I've been pushing everybody. Can you give me an example of when this has happened. Like, I understand your fear. I understand the rationale logic behind it. The podcast has been out there for ages. Has anybody got any example where somebody has been harmed directly from listening to a podcast? As of yet, nobody has been able to give me an example. Nobody has been able to give me a tangible example. What's interesting is the selective outrage around that is that I posted on LinkedIn very recently that a coroner has just found that medication, antidepressant medication, a coroner has said that a man has killed himself because of the side effects, the strong side effects to this medication. So there's clear, tangible evidence there that, that this is bad. And there's no outrage about that. So it got me thinking about hysteria. And what I started to think of, what I started to feel like is this whole thing around long form content, which is relatively new. Long form content podcasts are new, right? Very new in the context of things, right? Somebody like me being able to turn a camera on, pick up a microphone and talk to you about what I think and my opinions, being able to put it out there and it being able to be heard by large groups of people, right? In my case, thousands of people. In some people's case, millions of people. In Bartlett's case, millions of people, right? The idea that somebody like that can just do that is really new. So there's a fear around it. And it reminds me of when video games first started having guns in them. And I remember my mum and lots of other parents being like concerned, like this is going to warp the mind of children, right? These kids are going to play these video games and they're going to end up going out and killing loads of people. And again, you can understand that logic, right? You could understand why people would become hysterical about that, why people would see this shooting on, we'd never seen this before, right? And it's definitely going to warp people's minds. But ultimately, it didn't, right? Ultimately, there's never been anything happen where it's like, oh, it's because they were playing a game. I'm sure people have probably tried to link things to that, or it's played like a small role in it, but it never came to pass. And then it made me think about times within history where there's been hysteria. So I did some research around it. And there's been lots of examples of this. In the 18th century, when people started writing novels, particularly romantic novels, many critics thought that the novels would corrupt young women's morals and distract the readers from serious pursuits like religion and education. Like, that comes from a good place, right? They wanted to protect people. But ultimately now it seems ridiculous that people thought that a romantic novel would corrupt women's minds, right? But there was hysteria about that at the time. There was hysteria when the printing press came out. Scholars feared that mass printing would lead to spread of misinformation and a decline in the authority of church and traditional institutions, right? That was in the 15th century. So there was fear around that. There was fear around the telephone in the late 19th century. People feared the telephone would erode face-to-face social interactions and destroy family bonds. Now, you might go, well, actually, social media has gone on to do that and mobile phones in that way, but not the telephone. Most of us now would love to be able to go back, or some people would, to that. Here's one massive one for you. Jazz music in the 1920s. Many parents and religious leaders worried that jazz music, with its improvisation and African-American roots, would corrupt youth and lead to immorality. Again, absolutely ridiculous, but the hysteria came from a place of reality in those times. I'm not going to say good place there because a lot of that was rooted in racism, right? But it came from the cultural beliefs of that time, that this new thing that we don't know any about, that feels a bit frightening, feels a bit big. And so then there's hysteria around it. All right, shall I give you one more example? Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s. Parents feared that this tabletop game promoted Satanism and led to antisocial behavior. Again, it's fucking almost laughable that people used to think that, but they did. And so we have to be careful. Like, we see a lot of hysteria. There's a lot of hysteria around misinformation and people being able to get hold of this information. People have always been able to read alternative views in books. Is it different now that it's slap bang in their face? Yeah, it's different, but it's still unfounded. And one of the problems I have is this hysteria is now, I think, heightened because of social media. So the line is, people just come on and be, if somebody says to me, what about vulnerable people? That's what I'm worried about. It makes their argument altruistic. And so then when you kick back on it, it makes you seem like you're the crazy one and you're being uncompassionate, when actually I'm like, let's seek truth. So this whole kind of, what's the word that I'm looking for? I don't want to give power to somebody else to get to choose what I think is misinformation. Give me all the information and let me make my own choice. I think that's really, really important. And then we have to allow people to talk about their fears and concerns, however uncomfortable that makes you feel. And that's what's really important, is like when we're talking about these difficult subjects, right, that come up when like around neurodiversity, for example, right? It's the neurodiversity. I'll talk about this one because I have personal experience of it. It's an issue that's close to my heart. I also understand as well that there are things that are talked about in the neurodiversity space by people that are neurodiverse, and it's very difficult and uncomfortable to kick back against some of the beliefs and opinions that people who are neurodiverse have around neurodiversity. But in order to be able to have the conversation around these things that are still new, we have to have them uncomfortable conversations, right? And that's what's difficult. But that's what we need to get better at. We need to get better at uncomfortable conversations. I feel like we used to be better at them. I feel like it's got harder. I think cancel culture plays a role in that now, because if you're not seen as to be on the common narrative, and again, this will relate to some of the scapegoating stuff that we're going to talk about in a minute. If you're not seen to be on that kind of common narrative around it, you could be scapegoated. You could be ostracized for your opinion. And as we're going to go on to see when we talk about scapegoats throughout the history of society, lots of people start off as scapegoats because they're going against the grain. They're talking against the common narrative and talking about something different. And some of these people go on to be lauded as some of the best people. And maybe that's a good segue into talking about the scapegoats. And again, I've got some sort of historical context here around this. I've been talking recently a lot more about the positive traits in the scapegoat. And here's what I believe. I believe one of the first steps to breaking any dysfunctional society, the first steps to breaking any dysfunctional cycle, normally those first steps are becoming the scapegoat. And people within that system, whether that be family system, cultural system, work system, people scapegoating you, making out like you're the crazy one. Because ultimately, and I made a note of it here, scapegoats in families, workplaces, or social groups, often those that see the dysfunction clearly and challenge it. Their unique ability to be able to perceive and name what others avoid is ultimately what creates change. By reclaiming their voice and refusing to conform, scapegoats become the disruptors who pave the way for healing and growth. So, like, I think this is really important to understand. Wherever there is power, and I might have talked about this before, but wherever there is power, you will find abuse of power. All right. Wherever there is power, you will find abuse of power, because power is so addictive. The same as like wherever there is a pub, you'll find an alcoholic. It doesn't mean everybody in the pub is an alcoholic, but you'll find one in there. So where there is power, you will find abuse of power. It's just almost inevitable, right? So when we understand that we live within abusive structures, that happens because I actually believe, my personal opinion, as far as I can see, although I can't, it's not a really fixed opinion because I haven't done too much research into it, but I've sort of read bits, and bits have come up in other things that I've read. But as far as I can see, I do believe in a hierarchy. However, what ends up happening is that you will always have abuse of that power. So we live in abusive systems, right? Because there are people within power. Those people within power then abuse the systems. This happens in a family system, right? So within a family system, there is a huge power structure, but never more so than within a family, right? As children, we are completely dependent on our parents, particularly for the first 4 years. But, you could argue up until we leave the home. But in the first 4 years, we die if we didn't have our parents look after us, right? Because we are completely dependent. And that's to do with the brain developing on the outside, the way that we have evolved. When we went up onto 2 legs, the hips narrowed and you couldn't get a fully formed brain out. So think of a horse or a cow or whatever. When they're born, the brain's done a lot of its forming on the inside. So when it's born, it can walk straight away. As babies, we can't do that. It can take a few years in many cases for us to be able to walk, right? And that's because when the hips narrowed, you couldn't get the fully formed brain out. So the brain is not like a hand in that when you're born, it's just small and grows bigger. The brain is not formed, and it forms in those initial years. So we are completely dependent on that attachment to our parents. So there's a huge power dynamic there, right? It's a huge power dynamic, right? The parent, and not just the parent, but the adults around that child literally play a role in how that brain develops. This isn't controversial science. It's just not talked about that much. But it's quite basic science that the brain develops based on its environment. I had a guy, I think I've talked about this before, but a guy, I called him this last time, a brain guy, because I don't know what the fuck, I can't remember what he was. But he said, if you imagine that it's like loads and millions bits of string, and every interaction that you have, those bits of string come together to form the brain, right? They create pathways to form the brain. So the power there for the adults within a child's life in those initial years is huge. It's a huge power dynamic. So if you have somebody abusive within that, somebody who takes that power and abuses it, and look, for balance here, I would argue that as parents, we all abuse our power from time to time, right? Most parents are probably at a time, you might have regretted it afterwards, but said, don't do this to a child, and they say, why? You say, because I said so, right? Because you haven't got the emotional capacity or whatever. That's an abuse of power, really, because actually you should be able to explain to them why, and you shouldn't be able to just tell them no just because you fucking can. That's an abuse of power. But it happens, right? We all do that. So if you then imagine that there's a sliding scale of that, and when we get up to the kind of top level toxic people that I often talk about, then we're talking about like a real true abuse of power here that goes on. You're kind of shaping this child into being what you want it to be in order to fucking meet your needs. Then you've got this abusive system, right? So different children within that dynamic will then take on different roles, right? You'll have the kind of golden child, often known as the hero child. That's the one that this parent can look to and say, we must be doing something right. Look how amazing this child is. You'll have the mascot, the one who's sort of trying to make everybody happy all of the time. Then you'll have the scapegoat. Now, the scapegoat is often the one who sees things clearly. And I've talked again about this. I've always seen things clearly in my life. I am doing actually some work now with a one-to-one with an IFS coach who's amazing, by the way. And if you're interested in connecting with him, let me know, because I'll put you onto him because he's brilliant. But I'm doing some work with him, and I realize now how I was scapegoated in school a lot. How I was constantly had adults looking at me going, "Oh, that's the Josh logic." Like where have you got that thought process from? I'll give you quite a simple example, but one that really sits with me. I had my eyebrow pierced when I was a teenager, and you weren't allowed to wear an eyebrow bar at school, right? But some teachers let you wear it, right? And I remember my mum had been called out of school, and I remember the year head. I used to get into battles with him, because I was very I was able to see truth and tell truth. And I remember him saying, "I know that you sometimes wear your eyebrow bar," and I said, "I do sometimes wear my eyebrow bar." He said, "But you're not allowed to wear it," and I said, "Yeah, but some teachers let me wear it." And he was like, "But you're not allowed to wear it. It doesn't matter if some teachers let you wear it." And I said, "Well, then you need to," this is what I said to him, "you need to speak to your teachers that let me wear it then, because if none of them let me wear it, I wouldn't wear it." And he's like, "That's not the type of logic that you can have." And I was like, and I said to him, if every classroom that you went into had a pot of gold in the corner of it, and you knew you could get away with taking it in some of the rooms but not in the others, you'd take it in the rooms that you could take it in from, wouldn't you? And I remember him rolling his eyes and going, oh, there you go, Josh logic. Now, over the years, I've kind of like developed in my realization of that type of thinking. But ultimately, there's truth in it, right? And so rather than him going, fucking, like, I probably need to speak to the teachers, I'm just going to scapegoat this child here because it's easier. Now, rules are there, rules are to be followed. You shouldn't break them just because you can get away with breaking them, okay? So I understand that, but I still think the point there that I'm highlighting, which is like, you scapegoat the one that can see the truth a bit more, the one that sees the patterns that goes on. It's much easier to scapegoat that person. And again, we see this in history of society. What happens is, in a dysfunctional, abusive family, the rules in there will be quite dogmatic, right? They'll be led by the abuser. You do this because I told you to. Or the rules will change on a fucking sixpence because the abusive person within the structure decides they're going to fucking change and everybody needs to go to it, right? That happens in a family system. You see that happen. And by the way, when they change, you'll always be told that they're altruistic in the way that they changed it, right? It'll always be dressed up in a certain way because that's how abuse happens. And we see that happen on a social level all of the time, right? And then on a social level, what happens is people will abuse their power, use their power for their own gain, and they will dress it up to you as if I'm doing it for you, for the good of you. That happens all the time in society, and it happens all the time within a family structure. Now, the golden child will accept what's going on, right? If the abusive mum or the abusive dad changes the rules and says from now on, this is going to happen, and the scapegoat's like, well, that ain't fucking right, yeah? But the golden child takes it, does what they're told. You see that happen all of the time in society. We will have golden children. If you look at the pandemic that happened, and like, again, let's not talk about whether that was right or wrong. Like abusive people always use some truth. They'll take some truth, mix it up with a load of shit to make sure that they get what they want. That's what I believe happened during the pandemic, right? You have the golden children that follow it, right? They're just like, no, I'm going to do what I'm told. I'm doing what I'm told, and I'm told to do this because it's for the good of the people. And everything that the people do in power is always for the good of people, which to me just fucking sounds ridiculous, right? Because I can see like every political party, yeah, like if they came round, if you were looking for somebody to fucking change your boiler, and a political party came and you looked at the reviews of the political party and looked at their history of what they'd done, you wouldn't fucking let them anywhere near your boiler because they've got a historical, a history of just being full of shit and lying. Right? So, like, can people not see that? Like, to not believe them is not stupid. It's fucking quite rational to question everything they do and to want to see clear proof of everything that they've done, right? Again, that kind of thinking will get you scapegoated in society, and it also gets you scapegoated within the family, right? If you just accept what they do, you ignore all of that other shit, right? Ignore the fact that historically they lie, that historically they manipulate. Ignore that and do as you're told. Do well in your exams, you'll be lauded. You'll be held up and you'll be seen as good, right? You'll be seen as somebody who's keeping the peace, right? You'll be seen as somebody who cares about the system, who cares about the structure. So you can see how inviting it is to be a hero child, to be a golden child. You can see how that's attractive in a family system, and you can then see how that is attractive within a societal system. Yeah, you can see how it is attractive to be that. And then again, if we look at a family system, you take a family system, there'll be obviously some buildup of resentment here, a bit like we talked about earlier, right? There'll be a buildup of resentment that's going on. It's under the carpet because it's all swept under the carpet because you can't talk about it, right? Because if you talked about the truth, then you'd have to fucking look at the truth, which is that we exist in an abusive family system. On a societal level, it gets swept under the carpet because nobody really wants to see the truth that we live in an abusive system and we're powerless over so much stuff. We're fed this fucking information all of the time. Remember, you can be whatever you want to be. In America, it's the great American dream, right? We're sold that all of the time. If we looked at the truth of the situation, right, we'll see that the idea that that we have the powers that we're told that we have is bullshit. So we have to sweep so much under the carpet. We can't talk about the truth because if we do, then we have to look at that. In a family system, the same is true. If we talk about the reality of stuff, we'd have to look at the fact that our mum or our dad is abusive or that our mum or our dad has got an addiction problem. So it all gets swept under the carpet. But as a result of that, there's difficult feelings, there's difficult emotions. They need to go somewhere because they don't go away. All right? They don't go away, right? So the scapegoat then is the one that catches a lot of the fucking shit from this because we need to find a scapegoat. So in an abusive family, the parent might start to look at me who's getting in trouble a little bit at school and this is fucking, if you weren't doing this, we wouldn't have this problem. You know, if you weren't so naughty, everything would be fine. And that happens on a societal level. In the 90s, particularly in the UK at least, it was very much like addiction. If there weren't addiction and homelessness, then fucking we wouldn't have all of the problems. You should be really pissed off with people on benefits because they're the reason you're suffering. In today's, it's like you should be really pissed off with immigration because if it weren't for immigration, we'd have this rich and prosperous life. It's nothing to do with the big transfer of wealth that happened during the pandemic. It's nothing to do with the billions of pounds that we transferred towards wealthy people during the pandemic. It's nothing to do with the fact that the big powerful corporate people don't pay their tax. There's billions and millions of pounds wrapped up in that. It's nothing to do with them, yeah. It's over here. It's the immigration piece and the people coming in on the boats, yeah. Scapegoat them. And then what happens is, in the dysfunctional, let's go back there. I hope you're sticking with this and keeping up with me. If you go back to the dysfunctional family system over here, the siblings start arguing with each other, yeah. The hero child's just pissed off with a scapegoat. You keep upsetting our mum or you keep upsetting dad, yeah. So this is fucking your fault, right? You keep doing this. This is on you. This is your fault. And then the siblings go against each other and the person that's abusing the power at the top gets away with it time and time and time again because nobody's looking at that. And this happens in society. And the billions that was transferred in wealth. And by the way, let me just quickly say this, right? We throw around billions now like it's the same as millions. People group them together all the time. Millions and billions of pounds over here. Let me show you the difference between, and I heard this recently and I'm going to get it wrong, but I might actually just Google it here while I'm doing it, right? 1 million seconds, right? Have a little guess. How many days is 1 million seconds, right? Have a little guess. All right, let's see how close you were. 1 million seconds in days is 11 and a half days. So 1 million seconds is 11 and a half days. Now let's look at 1 billion seconds into days, but we're going to put now how many times, if 1 million seconds is what we just said, which I can't now remember, 11 and a half days. What's 1 billion seconds in days? Have a little guess. And I'm going to tell you now once I get it up so I can get it right in front of me. 1 billion seconds, I'm not even going to tell you in days because it's too many. 1 billion seconds is 31.7 years. So 12 and a half days for 1 million seconds, 31 years for 1 billion seconds. That's the difference in what we're talking about here. So when you're trying to think, when you're thinking about wealth and the discrepancy between wealth and the inequality that we see within wealth, when we're talking about billionaires, that's what we're talking about. Yeah, and I was watching a documentary yesterday, I think, and they talked about I can't remember. I'll butcher that too much, so I can't remember it, so I'm not going to say it. But we need, look, as a result of what I'm trying to say here, it's always, not always, but it's often scapegoats that change the world. We need scapegoats within abusive structures because eventually if the scapegoat shouts loud enough, then the scapegoat will get listened to. But the scapegoat, when they first start shouting, is always made out to be crazy. And again, like, this links to all of that kind of misinformation stuff, yeah? Because if you imagine in an abusive, you don't have to imagine it. In an abusive family, when you're a child, the information that you know, what you believe to be normal, what you believe to be okay, is fed to you solely by the person that's abusing you. So your idea of misinformation is shaped by somebody who wants to control you within an abusive family, yeah? What might that look like in an abusive family? An abusive family member might get you to not trust other adults. An abusive family member might get you to not trust social workers. An abusive family member might get you to not trust teachers that want to know about your family. An abusive family member might tell you to not listen to other adults that tell you that you shouldn't do X, Y, or Z within a family. They get to decide what is information and what is misinformation to you, and they will do whatever they can in order to get you to believe that. And if you start to come and say, well, hang on a minute, what about this? You'll be scapegoated. You'll be made out like you're fucking crazy. This is what we see on political, social level. If the people in power get to choose what I see as misinformation, they're gonna abuse that, right? It's not. That's not like a guess. That's not like a wild accusation. Historically, we've been told that is true. So we should always be questioning that. And like, you know, it's not just political power. We should look at you look at, I'm not going to name it, but it begins with a P. There's an F straight after the P and it ends in right? And they provide a lot of like pharmaceutical stuff, right? Think about it. Since the year 2000, they've been fined, and you can check this, and you can fact check it if you want, right? They've been fined over £11 billion. They've been fined, and I think it's 5.5 billion of that, yeah, was for unsafe medication, right? Safety incidents. This, so to question them, to at least question them, and it's not to say that because of that, then they're going to be wrong every time. It's not to say that, you know, they don't do anything good in the world. Abusive people fucking, in a family system, abusive people, the abusive parent will often work for a charity, or they're a fucking therapist or something like that, right? So it's not to say that they don't do any good in the world. Of course they do. Are they doing that good just so that nobody sees that they're doing the bad? I think you'd have a good argument for that. Could that be true with pharmaceutical companies? Well, I don't know, but let's look at the fucking facts and then make our decision for that. And let's at least be able to challenge that. And yet, if you go, well, hang on a minute, like, we're rolling this vaccine out now and being told that we have to have it. And again, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm not saying whether the vaccine is right or wrong. That what I do know, what I do believe is that fucking vaccines have saved the lives of millions and millions of people historically. And to question them making me have it is not stupid. It's just looking at the facts and going, all right, like I think you're really good at doing these things that do save lives. I think you're also really good at doing things that just make you profit and sometimes injure people. So let me fucking see all of the facts and let me have a public conversation about it so that I can find the truth. And I've had this happen to me the other day on LinkedIn. I sort of brought up this idea, and then all of a sudden you're made out like you're an anti-vaxxer. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. I've never said I'm against them. I'm all for them. I just want to make an informed decision, and I'm not handing you the chance to make that informed decision for me. Now, the problem is, within a family system, keep up with me, within a family system, when you're a child, you rely, particularly when you're a child, sometimes still into your adulthood, you rely on the parent. So you have to have a level of hoping and belief that they're going to do right for you, because you need to lean on them, because without them you wouldn't survive. The same is true here with political things, with those within power. Yes, I do need to lean on you. I have to somewhere within me find a certain amount of trust, because I have to believe that there are people that know better. Within a family system, I have to believe that the adult knows better. I have to, because I have to give them, I don't have a choice but to give them trust. Again, this is true within political and power structures that we live in society. I have to hand you a level of trust. I have no choice. Yeah. But oh my God, I hope the mic didn't pick up that burp. It definitely did, didn't it? I'm so sorry. Oh my God. Pardon me. I hope that we can continue to have these conversations. But I did want to highlight a couple of scapegoats throughout history, because I think it's important. One of the most obvious ones to think about is Nelson Mandela. And if I can just find what I've got written about him here. Nelson Mandela grew up under the apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation in South Africa that disenfranchised and oppressed the black majority. As a leader in the African National Congress, he was labeled a terrorist for organizing resistance against apartheid policies, leading to his imprisonment for 27 years. He went to a prison for 27 years. Mandela's resilience and refusal to give up on justice turned him into a global symbol of resistance and oppression. His leadership after his release, marked by forgiveness rather than vengeance, helped South Africa transition into a multicultural democracy. He proved that change is possible even within the most entrenched systems of justice. You can see that the belief systems within Africa at that time meant that he was fucking crazy, that he was the wrong one, that he was bad. He was in prison for it. And now when we look back, we go, wow, they imprisoned him. Happens all of the time. Can I give you another example? Joan of the Arc. So Joan lived in a feudal system dominated by the Catholic Church, where women were expected to remain silent and subordinate. Her claim of divine visions and her role as a military leader defied both gender norms and church authority. Captured by her enemies, she was put on trial by a biased tribunal, accused of hearsay, and burned at the stake. Joan's courage to act on her convictions inspired French forces to rally during a critical period of the 100 Years' War, turning the tide in favour of France. Though condemned in her time, she was later vindicted and is now a symbol of how the press can challenge unjust systems and leave an enduring legacy. So again, this is what happens here, is they take the fact back then that she had these divine visions, they make her crazy, and then they burn her at the stake. And we see this happening in time and time again now. Whenever anything goes against the common belief systems, anybody that goes against them is going to be labeled as crazy. It's going to be seen as completely crazy, and eventually sometimes can come out to not be seen as that, to be seen as change makers. And so I know for me, I would much rather be a scapegoat. I would much rather be a scapegoat. I'd much rather continue to challenge the norms, continue to challenge the truths. And listen, there may be some of the things that I've said in here might have made you feel uncomfortable. And for me, truth is what matters. Trying to get back to the truth is what matters. That means that sometimes I have to challenge myself and I make myself feel uncomfortable. It happens to me regularly, right? Where I'm like, I'll read something and I'll be like, right, let me try and make that wrong, because it means that something that I've been saying maybe publicly is now wrong. So I'm going to try and make this wrong. And then I look and I think, oh, nah, I need to come back. And that happened time and time again, by the way, in my recovery. When I look at my recovery from alcohol, that happened time and time again. I would pick up this belief system. I'd become quite evangelical about it. And then I would realize that I've changed my mind. And then I would have to go back and do something different. And that's not easy. But true, meaningful change happens when we have the ability to be able to do that. So listen, this has been one of the longer podcasts, but I've enjoyed it. Anyway, what time are we on? Yeah, I've enjoyed doing it. And yeah, massive celebration, 10th podcast. Maybe I'll lose listeners for this. Maybe I won't. We'll soon find out. But one thing is for sure, and that is that I've been Josh Connolly, and this was definitely dysfunctional. I did tell you it would be dysfunctional, so thank you for sticking around till the end here. And if you have enjoyed this podcast, then please help me to grow Dysfunctional by sharing with your friends on social media. You can find me at Josh_FFW. And then wherever you're listening to this or watching this, please make sure that you've liked and subscribed, left us a 5-star review and a comment if your platform allows it. And I'll see you on the next one.